Shalom and welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where yesterday we started reading a new book, Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud. Interesting material, a little more academic, a description of Akiva's life the more I research on the book. But if you've got suggestions on a book you want to hear and it fits into Kindle edition and I can easily access it, then maybe we'll read it. But today we're on Chapter 2, titled A Self-Created Sage. Well, as I have discussed, it is impossible to reconstruct the true biography of Rabbi Akiva, given the distance in time and the nature of the sources available to us. Instead, we are imagining a biography of Akiva. But even here, our task is complicated by the fact that we are presented with a variety of sources about Akiva from a variety of places within the vast corpus of rabbinic literature. These sources differ from one another, sometimes considerably and sometimes in only small details, raising the question of how we should deal with these differences in constructing the story of his life. Texts from the earliest layer of the rabbinic world were reshaped and adapted by later authorities, sometimes because of inherent complications involved in transmitting oral traditions, and sometimes, at least we suppose, for polemic or apologetic reasons. In looking at the stories of the life of Rabbi Akiva, particularly those about his beginnings and his marriage, these difficulties become particularly obvious. Was Akiva an unmarried shepherd who began his studies of Torah for the love of a good woman, or was he already a married man with a young son when, through his own intuition, he discovered the importance of learning? Both traditions can be found in rabbinic literature. One conventional approach has been to harmonize the various strands, ignoring as best as possible these contradictions and creating a seamless narrative. We can see this tactic in a number of retellings of Akiva's life. On the other side, academic scholars tend to aim at disentangling the various strands of tradition, trying to speculate about the historical process involved in transmission. Some scholars have focused on looking for the so-called historical kernel, that is, the real events, embedded within the legend. But as I have discussed in recent years, the attraction and legitimacy of such an approach has faded for a host of good reasons. In this chapter, I take a different slant. My goal is not to harmonize the various traditions, nor is it to take the academic scholar's approach, though there will be times that I present their insights. Rather, I aim to look at a variety of traditions and hold them up against one another to see what we might imagine about Akiva's early life and why the Jewish tradition has chosen to preserve these tales across the generations. What, in other words, are we meant to learn from exploring the stories about the origin of one of the greatest heroes of rabbinic culture? It's worth remembering that the stories and teachings of Akiva are those that have come down to us after and in the light of the work done by the ancient anonymous editors of the Talmud and other rabbinic works. We are heirs to that entire tradition, and focusing on the complex, multi-layered biography of Akiva with all its contradictions seems to be the wisest course. That and maintaining a self-consciousness about our efforts in which we keep in mind the usefulness of acknowledging the ways that historical processes of editing and transmission are valuable interpretive tools. This point of view has something in common with the approach of contemporary biblical scholars. Yes, we recognize that the Bible is composed of a set of complex, interwoven sources, and at times it is helpful as scholars and interpreters to pull those pieces apart and look at them individually, but in the end, the Bible as we have it now, as it has been known for centuries, has its own integrity. These matters are particularly relevant when we turn to the early life of Rabbi Akiva. Here we notice that, in fact, there are two main traditions about his origin. One we might call the philosophical version, and the other the romantic version. In this chapter, I explore the philosophical version. I look at the romantic tale in Chapter 3. The philosophical telling of the story is found in a rabbinic text known as Avot de Rabbi Nathan, the Fathers according to Rabbi Nathan. Avot de Rabbi Nathan is a text with a complicated history, Parts of it are quite old, dating back close to the time of Akiva himself, but scholars have now shown that other sections can be dated to as late as the early Middle Ages. Avot de Rabbi Nathan has a good deal in common with Tractate Avot, which in a slightly expanded version is more popularly known as Pirkei Avot, literally Chapters of the Fathers, though it is often translated as Ethics of the Fathers. Avot differs from almost anything else in rabbinic library because it involves virtually none of what most characterizes the literature of rabbis, that is, disputation around matters of law and interpretation of Torah verses. Nor does it contain legends about biblical or rabbinic figures. Instead, it consists of a series of fairly pithy statements about the life and ethical behavior. It is eminently quotable. Very few people have sat through sermons of contemporary rabbis without hearing quotations from Pirkei Avot. Avot de Rabbi Nathan has much in common with the Mishnaic Tractate Avot, but it does contain legends about the rabbis that we do not find in the Mishnah. Most importantly, a story about Akiva's early life. Making things a bit more complicated is the fact that Avot de Rabbi Nathan exists in two versions, called without much originality Version A and Version B. We need not go into more detail about the comparison of these two versions. Suffice it to say that the story of the origins of Rabbi Akiva appears in both versions of Avot de Rabbi Nathan with some small modifications, which I will point out. Here is the rendition from Version A. And I believe this is what Rabbi Goldberg shared with us about 4 weeks ago in our Genesis class. What was the beginning of Rabbi Akiva? It is said he was 40 years old and he had not studied anything. One time he stood at the mouth of a well and said, "Who hollowed out this stone?" He was told it is the water which falls upon it every day continually. They said to him, "Akiva, have you not read the verse, 'Water wears away stone,' from Job 14:19? Immediately, Rabbi Akiva drew the inference that the verse applied to himself. If what is soft wears down the hard, how much more so shall the words of the Torah, which are as hard as iron, hollow out my heart, which is flesh and blood." Immediately he turned to the study of Torah. He went together with his son, and they appeared before a teacher of young children. Said Rabbi Akiva to him, "Master, teach me Torah." Rabbi Akiva took one end of the tablet and his son the other end of the tablet. The teacher wrote down Aleph Bet, and he learned it, Aleph Tav, and he learned it, the book of Leviticus, and he learned it. He went on studying until he learned the entire Torah, and that's from Avot de Rabbi Nathan, Version A, Chapter 6. The story in Version B is quite similar to this one with some interesting differences. Both are based around the same verse from Job and the insight that Akiva gains by looking at the phenomenon in the physical world. In Version B, we learn of a specific location for the story, Lod in Hebrew, Lydia in English, a city about 10 miles southeast of modern Tel Aviv. And instead of a well created by water, Akiva sees a trench next to a well that has been dug out by a rope being dragged through the dirt. Version B adds a nice touch in which the anonymous they of our story ask Akiva, "Why are you so surprised?" before quoting the verse from Job. In addition, Version B fleshes out the curriculum that Akiva learns. In Version B, he learns not only the Hebrew alphabet. In other words, he learned the entire alphabet from first to last, and then the book of Leviticus, the traditional starting place for the biblical study, but also scripture, Targum, Midrash, Halakha, Agadah, arcane speech, and parables. He learned everything. Targum is the ancient translation of the Torah into the vernacular language of the times, Aramaic. And as we have seen, Midrash is the general term for rabbinic interpretive understandings of the Bible. Halakha is Jewish law, and Agadah is, loosely speaking, Jewish legend. Let us turn back to the story as told in Version A. Keep in mind these small variations. It begins by asking what was the beginning of Rabbi Akiva. The answer, certainly to a modern reader, is rather surprising. We do not, as we might expect, hear of his birth, his parentage, his ancestry, his geographical location. In other words, we learn nothing in the mode of biography as we might understand it. He appears as if out of nowhere. He is from no place and he has no background. The text begins with a 40-year-old man who had not studied Torah. That is all we know. Perhaps we are meant to emphasize the word rabbi here. What was the beginning of Rabbi Akiva? That is, what led him to become a rabbi? What we are given is the picture of a self-centered, a self-created individual. Akiva is someplace out in nature, near Lod, as version B tells us. He is not alone. Other unnamed people are nearby, and for some unexplained reason, Akiva begins to think about the well that he sees near him. This is not, it is clear, a well built by humans, but is something formed by nature. He asks the people around him, who made this well? They respond perhaps somewhat oddly to us, not with a scientific answer, but with a quotation from Scripture. They tell him that the water has worn away the rock, but the real proof is the quotation from Job. Why are you so surprised, Akiva? They are saying to him. Haven't you read the verse from Job that tells us that water wears away stone? Who are these scriptures quoting compatriots of Akiva's? The text doesn't tell us. The assumption seems to be that anyone should know the verses, and anyone should know that the way to understand the natural world is through the lens of Scripture. But of course, Akiva knows nothing. He doesn't know Job. He has no knowledge of Torah at all. We, the readers, have been told this from the opening of the story. He was 40 years old and had not studied anything, needed to learn his ABCs. To associate knowledge of the world and how it works, the way the well is formed, with knowledge of Torah is to suggest that the key to understanding anything is through Torah. And perhaps that is what version B means to tell us when it says he learned everything. Through learning Torah, Akiva becomes a philosopher, in the old sense of the word, one who knows the totality of things. For Akiva, this becomes a major theme of his life, plumbing the depths of Torah in all its intricacies and with all the imagination and creativity that a person can bring to that task. But the point of the story here is to communicate something more than the idea that in order to understand the natural world, one must study Torah. The more dominant motif of our story is the great personal insight Akiva acquires as he watches water cutting through stone. If water can cut through stone, he thinks, my heart can also be softened. And as we read the story, we are taken by surprise, because Akiva's question, who hollowed out this stone, leads us to expect a different answer. At first, this seems more like a theological question, a question about God and creation that would lead to Akiva's discovery of divine mastery of all nature, and we expect an answer to go in that direction. But Akiva seems to be asking a question about himself, not a theological one. What will it take to hollow out my heart? Judah Golden, a scholar who published the standard translation of version A in 1955, chose hollow out to translate the Hebrew word in the original text, hakak, though I think that carve out or shape is probably closer to what the text means here. The Hebrew word has a number of closely related meanings. It appears that he is saying that his hard heart needs to be softened or shaped the way a chisel shapes stone. Much here is puzzling. Why does Akiva think that his heart needs softening or sharpening, shaping? What does it mean to have one's heart changed in that way? Why is Torah seen to be as hard as iron? It is an uncommon metaphor for Torah in rabbinic literature, unlike, say, Torah as a tree of life. In fact, it appears in only one source that I could find, a fairly well-known midrash that compares the words of Torah to a well-planted iron nails. But that source seems to be much more about Torah's constancy than its power to break or shape the heart. Hardening of the heart is a biblical motif most familiar to us from the story of Pharaoh and the Exodus from Egypt. In the Exodus story, it is pretty clear that the meaning of a hardened heart is related to stubbornness or lack of compassion on the part of Pharaoh. The same Hebrew word appears in a different way in Psalms 95:8. Harden not your heart, where the meaning of a hardened heart in the context of the psalm is less about stubbornness or cruelty, as it was in the case of Pharaoh, than it is a theological matter, not trusting in God. In our story, the insight Akiva has about wearing away stone is applied to his own heart. Torah, he sees, might come to hollow out or shape his hardened heart. The two different meanings of hardening the heart from the biblical context may both apply here. Perhaps we are meant to understand Akiva is commenting on a lack of personal religious faith, as if reading the message in Psalm 95. Akiva now understands that he is distant from God. What he believes that the Torah will give him is a chance to connect with that which is transcendent, and at the same time he sees himself, like the biblical Pharaoh, locked in stubbornness and lacking compassion. These two dimensions about the purpose of learning Torah, the theological and the personal or ethical, are themes that we will see throughout Akiva's life. The original story, in other words, prefigures the enterprise of the rest of his life as the traditional sources have presented it to us. One peculiarity that might strike the reader in this interpretation is the notion that Akiva was lacking a compassionate heart. Where might we see this element of his character? Of course, we know very little from these stories about his early life. Indeed, from the point of view of the story we are looking at here, his life begins at the age of 40, but Akiva makes a few remarks in other places in which he looks back on his youth. One of the strangest is a comment quoted in the Talmud: "When I was an Am Haaretz, I said, 'Who will give me a sage so that I could bite him like a donkey?' His students said to him, 'Rabbi, you mean bite him like a dog?' He replied to them, 'No, a donkey, because a donkey bites and breaks bones. The dog bites but doesn't break a bone.'" That's from Peshasim, or Passover 49b. The context of this odd recollection is a number of statements in the Talmud about the relationship between the sages and the Am Haaretz, plural Amai Haaretz, a term for the unlearned masses who care little about their religious obligations. This is a strikingly vicious statement by Akiva, and one cannot help but feel that his reflecting back on his early life with the anger and regret with which a reformed sinner will recall his early misdeeds. It is not a psychologically surprising phenomenon, but the added dimension here is that it provides an additional way of thinking about his quest to unharden his heart. The ethical shortcomings of Akiva's early life, the aspects of himself that he feels he needs to change as he stands by the well, may be reflected in this story of his antipathy toward the very figures in society, the rabbis, with whom he would eventually identify. Viewed from the standpoint of historical scholarship today, making the connection between the story at the well and Akiva's comment about being an Am Haaretz is not so simple. The source for the donkey comment is the Babylonian Talmud, a work that was put together some 400 years after Akiva's time. As we saw in the last chapter, scholars have noted that the view of the rabbis living in the land of Israel toward the Am Haaretz is essentially one of distance or uninterest, but the Babylonian perspective was considerably harsher, owing perhaps to the differences between the general culture in Palestine, Roman, and the dominant culture in Babylonia, Persian, an interpretation suggested by the Talmud scholar Richard Kalman more than 15 years ago. The attitude towards the Amai Haaretz went far beyond uninterest or disdain in Babylonia, as evidenced by the statement of Akiva and by other similarly nasty comments that appear on the same page of the Talmud. As scholars have looked at the sources known to date from an earlier period, closer to the years during which Akiva lived, we don't have as much evidence for the kind of extreme antipathy between the common folk and scholars as reported in the Talmudic passage about the donkey and the dog. Hence, it makes sense to view the story as an interpolation from the latter traditions in the Babylonian Talmud, but it does provide an insight into how the Talmudic rabbis wanted us to view Akiva's early years. He was hostile, and then essentially he converted to the ways of the rabbis. The second part, that's a key point. The second part of the story of Akiva at the well highlights another central theme of Akiva's life, his intellectual brilliance. And indeed, the notion of his beginning his studies at the age of 40 serves the purpose of emphasizing his natural gifts even more than if he had started learning at a young age. That is, we are being told he began studying so late, yet look how much he attained. It is, of course, tempting to read this story as promulgating Akiva as an example of the idea that anyone can begin learning at any age, and so teachers and parents have used it throughout Jewish history, to be sure. Yet the more dominant theme may be the opposite. Look at the genius of this extraordinary man. He began with nothing and became the greatest Torah sage of his time. Only a person of immense talent could have achieved so much. Interestingly, there is a hint of Akiva's natural-born talent even before we get to the second part of our story, where we see him beginning with an Aleph Bet and eventually mastering everything. Akiva is standing by the well that has been created by the action of water wearing away stone. He has heard the verse of Job quoted to him and then read. Immediately, Rabbi Akiva drew the inference that the verse applied to himself. There is a subtle point that the Hebrew language expresses to the reader. Translated here as drew the inference, the text literally says immediately Akiva applied the principle of Kal Vachomer. The important concept or principle, and saw that the water wearing away the rock would be analogous to his own situation. Kal Vachomer, it's when that light bulb turns on. Akiva has certainly drawn an inference from the water and the rock, but it is an inference of a particular sort. The phrase Kal Vachomer is a technical term in rabbinic rhetoric for a certain type of argumentation. The term is often best translated as how much more, the more so. Come on. The structure of the logic is as follows. If X is true in a lesser situation, then Kal Vachomer, how much the more so should X be true in a greater situation? If we're supposed to get a good night's sleep every night, Kal Vachomer, how much the more so should we get a good night's sleep when we are taking an important exam on the next day? If a 40-year-old would be wise to have a flu shot, Kal Vachomer, how much the more so should an 80-year-old get that injection? Akiva's brilliance as a student, which we see in the second part of the story, is hinted at in his discovering the classic rabbinic principle of Kal Vachomer on his own with no training at all in rabbinic logic. It is as if to say that Akiva already has within him the seeds of rabbinic scholarship. He is a sage waiting to happen. The story told in Avot de Rabbi Nathan does not end with Akiva in the schoolhouse. As we saw earlier, he sat with his son and began with the Aleph Bet and kept on studying until he had learned the entire Torah, or as version B has it, until he learned everything. But the story continues with Akiva now turning to two of the greatest Torah scholars of his time. He went and sat before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. "My masters," he said to them, "uncover the meaning of Mishnah for me." When they told him one law, he went and sat by himself. This Aleph, he thought, why was it written? This Bet, why was it written? This thing, why was it said? He came back and asked them and reduced them to silence. That's from Avot de Rabbi Nathan, version A, chapter 6. It is interesting to note that all this happens after Akiva has learned everything, virtually on his own. An unnamed teacher is mentioned in the first part of the story, but the fact that the person is anonymous suggests that Akiva was not studying with one of the early and well-known rabbinic masters. Only after this period of individual study does he turn to the higher authorities, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Joshua ben Hanina. He asks them to teach him Mishnah, possibly this as an anachronism. Mishnah, the great compilation of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch that forms the cornerstone of much of latter rabbinic literature, was not edited until 100 years after Akiva's death. But perhaps the text does not mean refer to the Mishnah, but rather Mishnah in the sense of a teaching. The distinction is not terribly significant in this case. As I've said before, these texts about Akiva are put together much later than the period during which the action is supposed to have taken place. And the editors do not seem overly concerned about historical precision, a value much more of our time than of theirs. He is learning Jewish law or halakha. He has gone to study with these two great teachers, but the curious thing about the story is, what exactly are Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua teaching him anyways? In fact, it seems that Akiva is the one teaching them, or at any rate, he is the one confounding them. They tell him one halakha, and he goes off by himself and returns with questions they cannot answer. Akiva is consistently portrayed throughout these stories as a self-made man. What he possesses, it appears, is the ability to penetrate the tradition by asking the most fundamental questions of why. He ponders each letter in every word with a question, and then he ponders the sense of the whole, this thing, why was it said, as well. Surely Eliezer and Joshua have thought about these matters before, but there must be something in the way that Akiva thinks about them that is beyond their grasp. The story continues with a kind of commentary on Akiva and his relationship with his teachers. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer says, "I will tell you a parable to explain what this matter is like. It was like a stone cutter who was cutting away in the mountains. Once he took his axe and sat on the side of a mountain and began chipping away tiny stones. People came by and asked him, 'What are you doing?' He said to them, 'Look, I am uprooting this mountain and throwing it into the Jordan River.' They said to him, 'You can't uproot an entire mountain.' But he continued chipping away at the mountain until he came to a large rock. He crawled under it, broke it, uprooted it, and flung it into the Jordan, saying to it, 'This is not your place.' That is. This is what Rabbi Akiva did to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. Rabbi Tarfon said, 'Akiva, about you, Scripture says, he dams up the sources of the streams so that hidden things may be brought to light,' from Job 28:11. Things concealed from human beings, Rabbi Akiva brought into light." That's from Rabbi Avot Rabbi Nathan, version A, chapter 6. Most rabbinic texts engage with biblical verses in some manner or another, so it is not unusual, as we saw with Akiva at the well, that the text gives a central role to the quotation from the Bible. It is often instructive to look at the larger biblical context when the rabbis quote a verse, since the single verse mentioned may be intended to allude to other verses within the same biblical section. Indeed, if we look at the context in Job of the verse quoted here, 28:11, we see that the previous verses increase the connection to the parable of the stonecutter, and Avot de Rabbi Nathan, version B, in telling a similar version of this parable, brings in all three of the relevant verses. Man sets his hand against the flinty rock and overturns mountains by the roots. He carves out through rock. His eyes behold every precious thing. He dams up the sources of the streams so that hidden things may be brought to light, from Job 28, verses 9 to 11. It's interesting that the metaphoric core with which we began, hardness and softness, water and rock, returns here, though no longer focused on softening the hardened heart. Instead, the poem from the book of Job is interpreted by Rabbi Tarfon as a commentary on Akiva's ability to penetrate the difficulties of Torah. The Torah, which Akiva described as hard as iron at the scene by the well is now viewed as hard as rock, as the parable is explained. Akiva is like the stonecutter who is able to carve through that rock. More than that, he can stop the powerful flow of water with the purpose of those actions is shown as well. He uncovers secrets. He sees what others cannot see, every precious thing beneath those rocks and hidden things beneath the flow of water. Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer uses the parable of the stonecutter to describe Akiva as the student of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua, and Shimon's description of Akiva's effect is stark and cutting. This is what Rabbi Akiva did to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. We are brought up short by the bluntness of the comment, but if we look back at the description of their interchanges, perhaps it is not so surprising. Akiva asks questions that take them aback. We can view the parable in the stonecutter in two related ways. First, it is precisely the way Rabbi Shimon describes it. The rocks, the mountains of understanding that Rabbi Eliezer and Joshua had acquired are now smashed into pieces. They are overturned, thrown into the Jordan, as it were. And it also appears that the story is meant to tell us something else. Part of what we are being shown is Akiva's invention of a whole new method of rabbinic discourse. That method is one of the things that characterizes his entire career. The close and detailed interrogation of Torah, interpretation at its deepest and, we might say, at its most optimistic core. I say optimistic to mean that Akiva has a fundamental faith in the unending richness of the Torah, of the ability of the Torah to yield more and more levels of interpretation. Of course, from a scholar's perspective, Akiva is not the inventor of this approach to interpretation. A long history precedes him, and an even longer expanse comes after his time. But in the eyes of this particular story, he is the creator of something revolutionary. He becomes the hero of a new way of reading Torah. Interesting. In the story about Akiva from A Vote to Rabbi Nathan, we know nothing about the reaction of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua to Akiva's questions, except that they are reduced to silence. It is the parable of the stonecutter by Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer and his curt remarks about Eliezer and Joshua. This is what Rabbi Akiva did to them that gives the reader the interpretation of the story. Later in this book, we will look in some detail at the nature of Akiva's relationship with his rabbinic teachers and colleagues. But it is worth pausing here to consider Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus as he appears in A Vote to Rabbi Nathan. Eliezer is often identified as one of Akiva's teachers, along with Rabbi Joshua ben Hanina and Rabbi Gamaliel II, but it is hard to see that Akiva learns anything from him at all. As we will later see, Akiva and Eliezer have a long and somewhat tragic history together, and one wonders, are the seeds of later contention sown here in version A, telling of Akiva's experience as Eliezer's student? The question is particularly relevant because the story of the origins of Rabbi Akiva in A Vote to Rabbi Nathan is directly followed by the story of the origins of Rabbi Eliezer, as if we're meant to view these two rabbis as parallel figures. Eliezer's story begins like this. What was the beginning of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus? He was 22 years old and had not yet studied Torah. Once he decided, I will go and study Torah with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, his father Hyrcanus said to him, you will not have a taste for food until you have plowed the entire furrow. Like Akiva, Eliezer comes late to the study of Torah, and like Akiva, he begins to feel a burning desire to learn. It is possible that Akiva and Eliezer might come to feel a kinship with one another, given their origins, but that differences between the two stories of origin are as significant as their similarities. Akiva, as we've seen, is a man without a past. We know nothing of his parents. Eliezer, on the other hand, has a father, and though the geographical setting is not named, his father appears to be a farmer or landowner. It makes sense to assume that Eliezer has grown up on that farm. Hyrcanus is a boorish man, a fact confirmed by events that occur later in our story. Who cannot see the value of Torah and any reason for encouraging his son along that path? Hyrcanus is certainly insensitive to his son's needs and interests, but Eliezer's desire to learn is so great that he runs away from home, refusing all food until he arrives at Jerusalem to meet the greatest Torah teacher of his time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We can continue the story from where it left off. Eliezer went and appeared before Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai until a bad breath rose from Eliezer's mouth. Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, Eliezer, my son, have you eaten at all today? Silence. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai asked him again. Again, silence. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sent for the owners of the inn where Eliezer was staying and asked them, did Eliezer have anything to eat in your place? They replied, we thought that he was very likely eating with you, master. He said to them, and I thought he was very likely eating with you. Between both of us, we left Rabbi Eliezer to perish. Rabbi Yochanan turned to Eliezer and said to him, even as bad breath rose from your mouth, so shall your fame travel because of your mastery of Torah. Most readers of this story are struck and puzzled about the detail of Eliezer's bad breath. But I think the point here is both practical and metaphoric. In the practical sense, all of us know that a day without eating food will result in bad breath, thanks to the body's natural processes. But metaphorically speaking, Eliezer has chosen not to eat because he is seeking real food, namely Torah, and he is escaping from the father who can't understand his needs even when Eliezer says them out loud. What he discovers is his true father, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who can discern what is in Eliezer's heart even when Eliezer remains silent. And the bad breath gives the story a chance to give the punchline to Yochanan. Even as bad breath rose from your mouth, so shall your fame travel because of your mastery of Torah. It is, in other words, a story of a person's transformation from being unlearned to becoming a scholar, as the breath turns from bad to sweet. The structure of the story is as beautifully honed as a well-formed literary piece. When we compare Eliezer's story of origin with Akiva's, we see some obvious differences. Akiva comes from nowhere. He is not rebelling against a father. There is no father at all in the tale. There is no backstory and a vote to Rabbi Nathan. Akiva simply appears. In the same way, unlike Eliezer, Akiva is not seeking a father substitute. Read psychologically, Akiva's challenge to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua is the unembarrassed attack of an unencumbered man on his elders. Eliezer, on the other hand, needs to respect Yochanan. He needs to turn himself into the son and the disciple. Akiva is a tougher character. He is unhesitant in his challenge to those in authority, and in challenging them, he upends mountains and forges new paths. In the coda to the Eliezer story, Hyrcanus comes to Jerusalem intent on disinheriting his son. When Rabbi Yochanan sees Hyrcanus enter the room, Yochanan turns his eyes to Eliezer and tells him, you begin and deliver the teaching. Eliezer replies, I cannot even begin. He is at a loss for words. Here, once again, the motif of silence returns. But the story doesn't end there. It continues. Yochanan pressed him, and the other students pressed him, and finally Eliezer stood and delivered a teaching about things that no ear had ever heard. As he hears Eliezer talk, Rabbi Yochanan rises to his feet, kisses Eliezer on the head, and says to him, Rabbi Eliezer, my teacher, from you I have learned truth. It is a sensational and deeply moving ending to the Eliezer story. The master, Yochanan, has now become the student. Eliezer has become Rabbi Eliezer. The story ennobles Eliezer, but also shows the clear contrast with Akiva. Akiva is not a man of silence. When Yochanan speaks to Eliezer, the youthful Eliezer remains silent. When Akiva challenges Eliezer and Joshua, they are silenced. Eliezer is passive. He comes to Yochanan to absorb learning, and only after that, learning as a disciple, is he able to create his own brand of Torah. A teaching about things that no ear had ever heard, as the text says. But Akiva is self-invented. He has his teachers, but seems mostly to be teaching himself. It is not surprising in this context that there are places in rabbinic literature in which Akiva is compared to Moses. We see, for example, this remarkable statement in Pesikta Rabbatai, a midrashic text organized around the biblical readings for the Jewish festivals and other special occasions. Rabbi Aha said, "Things which had not been revealed even to Moses were revealed to Rabbi Akiva. To Akiva we can apply the verse, 'His eyes behold everything precious, every precious thing,' from Job 28:10, and that's from Pesikta Rabbatai 14:13. And that, I believe, Rabbi Goldberg shared with us as well a few weeks back. Once again, the same verse from Job that is associated with Akiva in Avot de Rabbi Nathan is applied here. Akiva sees what others cannot. Moses is the ultimate prophet in Jewish tradition. His wisdom comes directly from divine revelation. To Rav Aha, in this text, something about Akiva seems to be at the level of the prophet. It is the most dramatic example of a testament to Akiva's almost otherworldly intellectual brilliance, and it fits well with the notion that what we see in these stories is Akiva's self-creation. It is a complex character in these stories. His intelligence is extraordinary, and possibly his ego as well. What most remains, to my mind, is his hunger to change his life and to go down a different path to discover what will be revealed to him by his study of Torah. Perhaps the story about biting like a donkey is a later accretion, as scholars would certainly point out, but there seems to be truth in it as well. When Akiva sees water creating that well and understands that he needs to find a different way of being, we the readers cannot help but feel moved. The stories we have explored here leave many things unexplained. Most strikingly, we remain completely ignorant of Akiva's earliest life, except for the story about the biting donkey. The mystery of his first 40 years remains unsolved. Of course, rabbinic sources themselves were aware of this difficulty, and we can find within the tradition examples of attempts to solve this problem by filling in the gaps of the biography. But there is another version of Akiva's origin stories that had a profound impact on the way that he had been viewed. It is not about the Akiva who turned out to Torah out of self-discovery, the Akiva at the well. It is about Akiva who began his studies for a very different reason. He fell in love. We now turn to this version of the story. Chapter 3, A Love Story. All of the tales about the origins of Akiva, the most famous by far is the story of Akiva's romance with his wife. One need only look at the retelling of his early life in children's books, whether they be from the 1930s or 50s, or the last years of the 20th century, to see the persistence of this story. Across time and despite the changes in perception, the tale of Akiva and his wife remains the version told and retold. And it is no wonder the romantic narrative has many of the elements of a traditional fairy tale. And if Akiva's life story were presented today in a Hollywood movie, the love story version is how it would be told, or, as we will see, at least part of it. The main story appears in two places within the Babylonian Talmud and can be supplemented with details from other sources in the rabbinic canon. The two Talmudic versions are fairly close in how they tell the story, though we will explore some of the significant differences as we look at the tale. The core stories about Akiva's romance are found in the tractate Ketubot on marriage contracts and Nedarim on vows. The story in Ketubot begins. Rabbi Akiva was a shepherd of Ben Kalba Savua. Ben Kalba Savua's daughter saw how modest and outstanding Akiva was, and she said to him, "If I agreed to marry you, would you go to study with a rabbi?" "Yes," he replied. She was then secretly betrothed to him and sent him away to study with a rabbi. When her father heard what she had done, he threw her out of his house and vowed that she would not benefit from his wealth. Yeah, Rabbi Goldberg shared this one with us for sure. We are in a familiar territory here, the love story. The simple but noble shepherd, the wealthy landowner's daughter, and the daughter's banishment. We've seen this story before in folk tales and films. It's the Western with the rich cattle lord, the beautiful daughter, and the poor cowboy working on the ranch. It's the fairy tale of the king's daughter locked in a tower and the worthy but impoverished young man trying to reach her. In the last chapter, as we explored Akiva's self-creation as a sage, he stood by a well and understood his need to study Torah. Here, the story is motivated by the unnamed daughter of Ben Kalba Savua. It is she who chooses Akiva. It is she who makes the proposal. She recognizes his modesty and his outstanding qualities, and she is the one who takes action. In the text above, I use the word betrothed to describe their relationship. Some modern translations prefer to say that the couple got engaged, but engagement in our modern sense is too casual a word to describe the nature of marriage customs in the ancient Jewish world, and so I prefer the old-fashioned term betrothed. The marriage process in rabbinic law involved two stages: betrothal, called kiddush or eruvin in Hebrew, and the wedding itself, called nisuin or chuppah in Hebrew. These two events could be separated by as much as a year. The kiddushin phase, and this is the term that is used in the text above, was not a small matter. From the time of betrothal, the man and woman were in essence legally married. Only divorce or death could end the marriage. The second stage seemed to represent the sexual consummation of the marriage. What we might wonder was the purpose of having the betrothal stage at all. Couldn't a couple just have created a civil contract of intent with monetary penalties? One scholarly speculation about this question is relevant to our story. Once betrothed, a woman is no longer under the legal control of her father, in a world in which women, especially unmarried women, had few economic rights or legal power. This idea may shed some light on our story of Akiva and the daughter of Ben Kalba Savua. It is interesting that Akiva is described with the word modesty. The Talmud uses an Aramaic word derived from the Hebrew word zanua, a term for modesty often connected to the idealized qualities of women. There is a kind of gender reversal here. Akiva is the modest one. He is wooed by her, and she sets the terms for the marriage. And it is she who takes an action that she must have known would estrange her from her father. Interestingly, the root zanua also has the meaning of in secret, as if the text wants us to make the connection between Akiva's personal quality of modesty and his secret betrothal. Akiva's father-in-law is named Ben Kalba Savua, and he appears a few times in rabbinic literature. At times he is called Kalba Savua, at other times Ben Kalba Savua, meaning the son of Kalba Savua. Scholars assume that these are not two different people, but simply different versions of the same name. Often Ben Kalba Savua is mentioned alongside two other men, Ben Tzitzit Hakaset and Nakdimon Ben Gurion. These three were men of great wealth and prominence, living at the time of the Great Revolt against the Roman occupation. The Midrash on Ecclesiastes 7:19, for example, says that each one of these three was capable of supplying enough food for Jerusalem to survive 10 years during a siege. Hence, the Babylonian Talmud in Gittin Decrees of Divorce 56a tells us that the riches of these three men allowed the city to withstand the Roman attack until the radical element among the Jews undid their work. In describing Kalba Savua, the Talmud offers an explanation for the meaning of his name. He was called Kalba Savua because a person could go to his house as hungry as a dog, Aramaic kalba from the Hebrew kalev, meaning dog, and come out satiated, Hebrew savua, meaning satisfied. Both this etiology of his name and his support of the city in its time of crisis gives us a picture of a man of great generosity, attuned to the hungry and the needy. In that case, how do we understand his angry opposition to his daughter's marriage to Akiva? Perhaps this is simply the very human trait of a person applying different standards when he thinks about the world at large than when events affect his own family. I'm happy to support the poor and the needy. I just don't want them to marry my daughters. This is not a particularly noble quality, but we recognize its familiarity. And it raises another question. How are we to understand Akiva's social class and economic standing? The stories discussed in the last chapter give no indication of Akiva's coming from a disadvantaged background. In fact, we know nothing about his upbringing. He is simply a man who happens upon a well. But the notion of Akiva as coming from poverty is one that is part of his image down through the Jewish history. And there is a good reason for that. If we pick up the love story from its other telling in the Talmud in Tractate Nedarim, we learn more about Akiva's economic situation. The daughter of Kalba Savua betrothed herself to Rabbi Akiva. When her father had heard about it, he vowed that she would not benefit from his wealth. She went and married Akiva. In the winter, they slept in a hayloft, and in the mornings he picked the straw from her hair. If only I could, he said to her, I would give you a Jerusalem of gold. It's from Nedarim 58. This version of the story begins abruptly. There is no indication of why she wanted to marry him, as there is in other Talmudic story, and much more importantly, there is no precondition of Torah learning that she demands of him. She betroths herself to him, as in the other versions. She, not Akiva, is the one described as taking action, and by doing so, she engenders her father's anger. Her father cuts her off monetarily, and without pausing for a breath, our text moves from she would not benefit from his wealth to she went and married Akiva. There is something wonderfully decisive about that move. She hears her father's words, she defies him. For readers familiar with English literature, there's the unmistakable resonance of the famous line from the end of Jane Eyre, Reader, I married him, and so she did. Note that in these stories, Akiva's wife has no name. She is called the daughter of Ben Kalba Savua. In fact, the only place in early rabbinic literature that we are told her name is in version A of Avot to Rabbi Nathan, where we read that although Akiva had no merit from social status or ancestry, his wife Rachel had merit. In time, later tradition adopted the use of the name Rachel for Akiva's wife, despite this single attribution, and it became conventional to refer to her as Rachel, in essence harmonizing the various versions of the story. Akiva and his new wife, do not have an easy life. It is winter and they are sleeping in an unheated hayloft. The story in Nedarim gives us very little background to Akiva's situation, but here it makes sense to piece it together with parallel story that we've seen in the Ketubot text, and assume that Akiva is merely a worker in the employ of a wealthy Kalba Savua. Akiva is a simple shepherd, and we should not be surprised that without any family support, the couple find themselves struggling, living in a shed for storing straw. Notice also that this version of the story, unlike what we saw in the last chapter, does not describe Akiva as being 40 years old. Indeed, both Talmudic versions give us an image of a young man at the beginning of life, certainly an unmarried man and obviously attractive to his young woman. The two Akivas, the 40-year-old with a son that we saw in Avot to Rabbi Nathan and the young shepherd catching the eye of the boss's daughter, are not easily compatible. These are clearly separate traditions, but there is some overlap nonetheless. The story in Avot to Rabbi Nathan gives us some hints about Akiva's possible poverty as well, though not as obvious as what we see in the two Talmudic versions. They said of Akiva that he did not engage in a laborer's work once he began to study Torah, but rather he would gather 2 bundles of wood. He would take one bundle to the market and sell it there. The other he would take home and use to make a fire to keep warm. His neighbors complained to him, "Akiva, you are killing us with the smoke. Sell your bundle of wood and buy oil with the proceeds to light a lamp instead of a fire." He replied to them, "I'm not going to listen to you. I get two good things from the wood. First, I can keep warm by it, and second, I can get light from it." Avot de Rabbi Nathan, version B, chapter 12. A similar story appears in version A, chapter 6. The story appears right after Akiva's decision to begin his studies, and obviously it is meant to communicate the idea that the time he devoted to study was so important to him that he gave up regular work. In essence, he took on a practice, if not a vow, of poverty. Of course, this story tells us little about what Akiva's economic situation was before his decision to become a student of Torah, and it seems that the real cause of his poverty in the version of Avot de Rabbi Nathan is due to his single-minded pursuit of learning. This is a story meant to teach about the sacrifices a great scholar is willing to make in the name of his studies. But there is enough ambiguity here to allow us some latitude in seeing a connection between the two traditions, that of the Talmud and that of Avot de Rabbi Nathan. Immediately following the story of the bundles of wood in Avot de Rabbi Nathan, version B, we read a text that uses Akiva as an example of the importance of studying. At the end of life, when a person is called to judgment, the question will be asked, "Why did you not study Torah when you were in this world?" If the person answers, "Because I was poor," the response from the heavenly judge will be, "But Rabbi Akiva was poor." If the person says, "My ancestors laid up no merit for me," then the person will be told, "Rabbi Akiva's ancestors also did not lay up merit for him." Because of that, the text continues, "Rabbi Akiva will shame many, all who did not study Torah in this world." Avot de Rabbi Nathan, version B, chapter 12. Akiva is a model for dedication to Torah learning, but this text also reveals an image of Akiva's origins in poverty. Not only that, but the clause, "Rabbi Akiva's ancestors also did not lay up merit for him," is the rabbinic way of saying Akiva did not come from a family background distinguished by either lineage or exemplary behavior. Although this text comes from the traditions of Avot de Rabbi Nathan, perhaps there is an echo of the Talmudic stories of why Ben Kalba Savua may have been outraged by his daughter's decision to marry Akiva. He was a man without money, ancestry, or a good family name. As we'll see, Akiva's undistinguished family background appears in traditions in the Talmud as well. And although the version of the story told in the tractate Ketubot and Nedarim differ, two main common elements show a thematic unity between them. The rejecting father and the headstrong, perhaps even powerful daughter. Whether one looks at the story in the light of Akiva's 1st and 2nd century CE world, or from the perspective of 6th century Babylonia, the time of the composition of the Talmud, marriage practice by and large involved the father of the bride and not the daughter at all. Fathers arranged their daughters' marriages, and might possibly have benefited financially from the arrangements as well. Therefore, the presentation here of Ben Kalba Savua's daughter's activism in making this match is quite extraordinary. Indeed, no other story in rabbinic literature shows a Jewish woman arranging a marriage for herself. Rabbi Akiva's wife, in the words of the scholar Tal Ilan, took the initiative and proposed to her husband. It wasn't common in the time, that's for sure. The story of Akiva and his wife has a number of other interesting elements. First, it is a strikingly romantic picture. The picture of the struggling young couple living in poverty in a hayloft in the winter is like a scene from an opera by Puccini. In particular, we are struck by the tender and intimate gesture of Akiva picking the straw out of his wife's hair in the morning. It's almost a cinematic moment, a close-up of the young couple in love. He tells her he would buy her a Jerusalem of gold, if only he could. This phrase has occasioned a good deal of scholarship, exploring both textual meaning and the real-life analogs of the words. It turns out that Jerusalem of gold is referring to a piece of expensive jewelry, something that the impoverished couple could not imagine they would ever be able to afford. But Akiva's love for his wife moves him to wish for the means to adorn her properly. In a few places, the Mishnah mentions another piece of woman's jewelry called a city of gold. The term Jerusalem of gold does not appear in the early Mishnaic texts, but in later texts such as the Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem of gold is used. Something to explain the meaning of the term city of gold used in the earlier sources. In other words, in the early stages of Rabbinic Judaism, city of gold was a well-known piece of adornment. Later, Jerusalem of gold became a common term, probably for the same or very similar item. No matter which term we use, the item is what is known as a mural crown. A tiara that is used that uses the turreted outline of an ancient city wall to form its shape. Such items were found on statues depicting goddesses, especially the patron goddess of a particular city, in the ancient Mediterranean world. An excellent example is the collection of the J. Paul Getty Museum, which has a statue of the goddess Sybil wearing a mural crown, dating from around the time of Akiva's birth. Tiaras of gold, often shaped in the form of a city wall, were given as gifts to men who first climbed the walls of a conquered city and to women who were civic patrons of institutions in a particular community. The scholar Susan Marks has suggested that we should view Akiva's wish to give his wife a Jerusalem of gold as not only a sign of their private romance, but symbolic indication of thanks for her being Akiva's patron, supporting his efforts to study Torah, a commonly valued activity. Rabbinic tradition sees Akiva as a person who eventually attained great wealth over time. The Jerusalem Talmud reports the following gossipy story later in his life. Rabbi Akiva made a city of gold for his wife. Rabbi Gamaliel's wife saw her and was jealous. She came and told her husband about it. Rabbi Gamaliel replied, "Have you done for me what she did for him?" Rabbi Akiva's wife sold the braids of her hair and used the proceeds so that he could go study Torah. The suspected adulteress, 9:15 from Shabbat, tells more of the exact same story. Yeah, Rabbi Goldberg read this story to us as well about 4 weeks ago in our Genesis class when he was discussing about Rabbi Akiva. And they're trying to show an image of this tiara, the way it might have looked, described as a city of gold, or, yeah. That's the statue of Sybil wearing the mural crown from the circa 50 CE from the Paul Getty Museum. Rabbi Gamaliel was the leader of the Jewish community in Palestine immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem, and therefore was an older contemporary of Akiva. We do not see interesting additional detail added here. Gamaliel tells his wife about the great sacrifice that Akiva's wife made for Akiva. She sold her braids so that the family could support Akiva's study. And even though the story about selling the braids is from a completely different source than the story about the poor couple in the hayloft, the Jerusalem Talmud for the first and Babylonian Talmud for the second, the literary reader today cannot help but connect the two stories and the hair motif. That is, Akiva picking straw out of his wife's hair in one, and his wife selling her hair in the other. The wish for a Jerusalem of gold in one, and her wearing a city of gold in the other. Returning to our story in Tractate Nedarim, We need to explore the question of Akiva's motivation to begin his quest to learn Torah. In the last chapter, we saw Akiva inspired by his excellent experience at the well. We saw the version of the story told in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Ketubot, in which Ben Kalba Suvua's daughter sets the condition that he must go study in order for her to agree to marry him. In the Nedarim telling of the story, however, we get another and surprising element, a miraculous appearance. Later, Elijah came to them, Akiva and his wife, appearing in the guise of an ordinary person, and cried out at the door, "Give me some straw, for my wife is giving birth, and I have nothing for her to lie down on." Rabbi Akiva said to his wife, "There is a man who does not even have straw." She said to him, "Go, become a rabbi." He went and studied with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua for 12 years. Interesting story. The prophet Elijah has held a powerful grasp on Jewish imagination since biblical times. His prophetic activities are detailed in 1st and 2nd Kings. But as important as his deeds were, the mysterious manner of his departing the world was even more gripping. Standing with his disciple and successor Elisha by the banks of the Jordan, a fiery chariot with fiery horses suddenly appeared and separated one from the other, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2:11. Elijah does not die. He is transported into the heavens. In essence, he becomes an immortal figure, appearing in human form in many legends. What we see in the story from Nedarim is the appearance of this mythic figure precisely at the time when Akiva is at his lowest point, locked in poverty and, we might imagine, without hope. Elijah, as the bearer of hope, is a typical motif in rabbinic literature, and indeed Elijah appears in a number of stories in Talmudic literature, specifically to rabbis who are in trouble. In our story, unlike some of the other tales in which the prophet appears to rabbis, it is not clear what precisely Elijah does to turn Akiva toward a life of study. We have the picture of his and his wife's poverty in winter in the hayloft, the straw in her hair, the wish for a Jerusalem of gold, the appearance of Elijah, and then without any other transition, we see Akiva's wife instructing Akiva to go study. Elijah certainly never tells Akiva that he must go learn Torah. Elijah's appearance only serves to highlight the fact that although the young couple is in dire straits, others are worse off. In other words, so often people get tunnel vision in their own situations and fail to realize that others are worse off. Once again, it's Akiva's wife who takes action. It is she who directs Akiva to leave. In some way, Elijah's visit leads her to recognize that their circumstances, as bad as they might be, are not catastrophic, that some people suffer more than they do, and this allows her to send him away. What we don't know is what happens between the lines. Has Akiva been saying that this is what he wanted to do, and she has been holding him back, perhaps out of fear, given their poverty? Or does she understand that within him, perhaps unknown to himself, is a talent for Torah that is waiting to be released? We have no evidence either way, but personally I prefer the second reading. And perhaps there is enough in the text to support it, albeit indirectly. Remember that in other Talmudic versions of the story, B. Ketubot 62b, Ben Kalba's Savua's daughter will not marry Akiva unless he studies Torah. Once again, she is the one pushing him in that direction. In both Talmudic versions, I think it's fair to infer that she has seen something in him beyond the physical form. Namely, that he is modest and outstanding. She recognizes his immense potential, perhaps even more than this modest man can see it in himself. The visit of Elijah allows her to take the risk and send Akiva to fulfill his destiny. And as the other Talmudic texts tell us, she sells her hair to allow it to happen. How are we to view the selling of her hair? As one scholar has pointed out, women's hair obviously had an erotic connotation in antiquity and was rarely let loose in public. We have also seen the erotic overtones in the description of Akiva's picking the straw out of his wife's hair. Clearly, Akiva's wife's decision to sell her braids was more than a simple monetary calculation. It was a deeply personal, even intimate gesture. Both stories from the Babylonian Talmud agree in most details about what comes next. Akiva goes off to learn and stays away for 12 years. Here is how the story continues in Tractate Ketubot. He went and spent 12 years studying. When he returned home, 12,000 students came with him. He heard an old man saying to Akiva's wife, "How long will you continue to be a living widow?" She replied to the old man, "If he would listen to me, he would stay another 12 years. Rabbi Akiva said, "So am I doing this with her consent?" He returned to his studies and stayed another 12 years. When he came back home, he brought with him 24,000 students. His wife heard and went out to meet him. The women in the neighborhood said to her, "Borrow some nice clothes and cover yourself." She quoted a verse to them, "A righteous man knows the life of his beast," from Proverbs 12:10. When she came close to Akiva, she fell on her face and kissed his feet. His students started to push her away, but Akiva said to them, "Let her go. What's mine and yours are hers." Her father heard that a great man had come to town, and he said to himself, "I will go to this great man, and perhaps he can annul the vow that I made, that his daughter not benefit from his wealth." So he went to him, and Rabbi Akiva said to him, "If you had known that your daughter's husband was a great man, would you have made that vow?" Ben Kalba Savua said to him, "If I had known only one chapter, or even only one law, I would not have made that vow." Akiva said to him, "I am he." Ben Kalba Savua fell on his face, kissed Akiva's feet, and gave him half his wealth. This section of the story is complex from a literary perspective in many ways. For one thing, the narrator is balancing a number of different characters: Akiva, his wife, the unnamed old man, the unnamed women in the neighborhood, Akiva's students, and Ben Kalba Savua, along with 2 times frames. Akiva's return after 12 years and his second return after an additional 12 years. On top of that, the narrator is juggling the reader's point of view, from seeing the world back and forth through the eyes of the wife of Akiva and Ben Kalba Savua in a kind of cinematic cross-cutting. This part of the story revolves around the question of what it means to know, to really understand another person. The theme gets expressed through the medium of speech, indirect and direct, overheard and face-to-face. The old man speaks to Akiva's wife, perhaps even taunts her as being abandoned by her husband for all these years. Like the women in his neighborhood, he represents the vox populi, the word on the street about Akiva and his wife. The parallel version told in Tractate Nedarim makes an even more pointed judgment about this anonymous voice in his wife's ear, calling him a wicked man who tells her that Ben Kalba Savua was right to object to her marriage and treat her as he did. Akiva, the wicked man, tells her, is not like you, that is, Akiva was her inferior in social status, and he abandoned her to a veritable widowhood for years. But she is unmoved by what the man says. From her point of view, Akiva should spend another 12 years in study. Akiva overhears her and realizes that he has her consent to continue learning. The fact that the text reports him saying to himself, "So I am doing this with her consent," leaves the impression that perhaps Akiva was wondering about what she was thinking about his extended stay away from her. But indeed, he had her consent all along. He returns to his teachers and stays another 12 years. Note that the wife's conversation with the old man happens directly, but it is indirectly heard by Akiva. At this point, we, the readers, are perplexed about how to read this interaction. Doesn't the old man, wicked or not, voice our own view of the situation? Hasn't Akiva abandoned her to a kind of widowhood? Yet, as the story proceeds, we see that in the case of Akiva and his wife, mere indirect speech is enough to communicate understanding. The direct speech of the old man and of the neighbors is what denotes a lack of knowledge. They don't understand that she really does want Akiva to be away studying. They don't understand that wearing fine clothes for her reunion with her husband doesn't matter to her or to him. The deep connection between them was forged when they were rebels against her father, living in the hayloft in winter. In the same way, Akiva's students don't understand the situation either. They see this woman and start to push her away. But of course, Akiva immediately knows who she is, and more than that, he says to them, "What's mine and yours are hers." In other words, everything that he has learned, and therefore everything that they have learned from him, really belongs to her because she made it possible for Akiva to become the great man, as the text emphasizes that he has become. This story presents some obvious difficulties for readers today. First, we are uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable, I would say, with the image of the self-sacrificing wife giving up her happiness, having to be a living widow, and material comforts, having to borrow nice clothes, just to support her man in his vocation. Second, Akiva's abandoning her for 24 years seems monstrous to us. Thus, we understand the view of the old man. We share that view today. Third, the verse from Proverbs that she uses to justify her behavior to her neighbors is unsettling. Is she really comparing herself to a beast owned by this righteous man? These are certainly troubling issues, and we should not ignore them, but we can be helped by viewing these materials through the lens of rabbinic culture in ancient times. That world, it goes without saying, was very different from the one in which we live today. And those differences are particularly striking when we look at the role and status of women in a male-dominated culture. Akiva is an unusual figure in rabbinic lore precisely because his wife is accorded such a significant role in his development. Tal Ilan, a feminist scholar of these materials, has devoted a good deal of analysis to the story of Akiva's wife, and she concludes that the persistent element of her role reflects the fact that Akiva's fame, unlike that of his colleagues, was in fact achieved with the help of his wife. Exactly what she did, how she helped, what support she rendered him, we do not know. But whatever it was, it must have been substantial if it left such an imprint on the minds of storytellers. The story, at least as far as we know, was written and shaped by men. Men originally told these tales orally, and eventually they were written down and edited by the unnamed men, whom scholars today call the stamaim, a modern term that essentially means anonymous ones. So, for those reasons alone, we should not be surprised that Akiva's wife is valorized for sacrificing herself to her man's needs. But we should also remember that his needs is an inadequate and much more personalized way of stating what Akiva accomplished in the eyes of the Talmud's later redactors. To their minds, he is a heroic figure, a person who both preserved and advanced the entire enterprise of Jewish life and culture. He saved the future of the Jewish people and shaped Jewish religion for all time. To them, the criticism that Akiva should not have left his wife would be tantamount to the belief that George Washington should never have left his farm in Virginia to lead the Continental Army, because in doing so he abandoned his family and left them to face hard times alone during the Revolutionary War. Akiva saying, "What's mine and yours are hers," is an enormous praise. The reader is meant to understand that he is not paying lip service. He means it. Akiva abandons his wife for 24 years. There is no way around that. As important as that might have been for Jewish history, she is left alone, and the attitude of the old man and the neighbors makes it clear to us that she must have suffered, even though she believed in what she was doing. How are we to understand the issue of Akiva abandoning his wife? It is important to examine the context in the Talmud in which the story is related. It appears among a set of stories over the course of a few pages in the Babylonian Talmud, in which the rabbis are debating the question of sexual obligations of husband to their wives. What frequency of sexual intercourse must a man provide for his wife? Some might be surprised to see such a question in the pages of the Talmud, but it is a work that is involved with a remarkably wide range of human behaviors. And this particular question is one that is framed in the earliest stages of rabbinic literature. The Mishnah in Ketubot 5, verse 6, states that Torah students, with the permission of their wives, can leave their homes to study for a maximum of 30 days. Other men, depending on their occupations, are allowed either longer or shorter periods of abstinence. The Talmud scholar Ben Daniel Boyarin has analyzed the pages of Tractate Ketubot in the Babylonian Talmud, in which this statement from the Mishnah is explored. In the course of the Talmud's discussion, no fewer than 6 stories on a single page about various sages are brought to elucidate the proper behavior of rabbis to their wives in regard to sexual obligations. All the stories deal with the conflict, as Boyarin succinctly puts it, between sex and the text. As he points out, the issues of scholars leaving home to spend time in the Bet Midrash, leaving their wives behind, was a matter of complex internal conflict within the values of rabbinic culture. Of course, by the time of the Babylonian Talmud, Torah study was held in higher regard than virtually anything else in Jewish life. Yet at the same time, marriage was constantly praised and valued in rabbinic literature. Part of what we are seeing in these passages of the Talmud, Boyarin demonstrates, is a contrast between 2 different models of dealing with the problem of sex and the text. In the Jewish community in Eretz Israel, the practice was for rabbis to delay marriage and spend their time in study before marrying, but the Babylonian tradition found this approach wanting. In that view, sexual desire would be too distracting for young scholars, so early marriages were encouraged. But this solution had its own profound difficulties because, in essence, it creates a class of individuals that Boyarin memorably calls married monks. How would these rabbis negotiate their obligations at home and their investment in learning? The multiple stories on pages 63a and b of Tractate Ketubot all represent various attempts to deal with this conflict of time and commitments. Most of the stories present examples of abysmal and at times tragic failure. One rabbi, Rav Rehumi, fails to come home to visit his wife. He would come home only once a year, and in this particular year he was so engrossed in study that he forgot to come home at all. The ironic consequence is that the roof upon which he is sitting while studying collapses and he dies. To make sense of the scene, we need to picture a flat roof, as is typical of Mediterranean settings. In another case, Rabbi Hanina ben Hakanai spends so much time away from home that when he returns for a visit, he cannot find his own house. Rabbi Hama ben Bisa returns home and does not recognize his own son, who has grown up during his absence. Real-life problems. It is at this point, after these other tales have been told, that our story about Akiva appears. Interestingly, and obviously with great intention of the editors, both Hanina ben Hakanai and Hama ben Bisa have spent 12 years away in study, the same amount of time that appears in the Akiva tale. But unlike their situations and unlike the tragic case of Rab Rehumi, Akiva's return and his relationship with his wife are seen as so successful that she sends him away for another 12 years. The editors of the Talmud have cleverly called upon the prestige of Akiva, one of the great figures of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, to justify the practice of the married monks of Babylonia, because of the weight of earlier Jewish tradition had asserted that even scholars whose vocation is so admired cannot spend more than 12 months away from their wives. The authorities in the Babylonian Talmud needed to find an extremely powerful figure to justify the practice of married monks. For as Boyarin puts it, symbols with great cultural authority were necessary, and there is none greater in Jewish tradition than Rabbi Akiva. Interesting. Akiva, as will be seen many times, is often the decisive person in a debate or represents the clinching argument made through personal example. In the story of Akiva and his wife, they are exemplifying the Babylonian idealized model, the husband who becomes a great man, and the wife who not only accepts but encourages his absence. The picture of deep connection between Akiva and his wife is evidenced in these stories, is disturbed, perhaps even undermined for the modern reader by her use of the verse of Proverbs to explain their relationship. She has no need to put on fancy clothes, she tells her neighbors, because a righteous man knows the life of his beast. Is she saying that she is like a mere animal? Is she saying that Akiva owns her the way a person might own an animal? To be sure, we are looking at an ancient culture that, like many others of its time, viewed women in a subservient role to men. There is no avoiding that fact. But there are certain complicating, if not mitigating factors at play here as well. Boyarin sees the tale as an extended metaphor in which Akiva is the shepherd and his wife is the beloved ewe. He thinks the name of Akiva's wife that is given in a vote to Rabbi Nathan, Rachel, in Hebrew, Rahel, a word meaning sheep or ewe, to the story we have here in the Babylonian Talmud. As we have seen in the Talmudic stories that we have been considering, Akiva's wife remains unnamed. It is only in a vote to Rabbi Nathan that we learn the name Rachel. But Boyarin argues we are meant to hear an association with that name, because on the next page of the Talmud, immediately following the Akiva story, we are told an anecdote about Akiva's daughter and behaving in a similar way to her mother. To explain the connection between mother and daughter, the Talmud quotes a proverb that puns off the name and word Rahel. You follows you. A daughter's acts are like those of her mother. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Boyarin argues that the Talmudic story is based on shepherd and ewe imagery, making it somewhat less unpleasant for modern readers. For Boyarin puts it, the metaphor of male lover as shepherd and female beloved as ewe is, in fact, common in biblical discourse, used frequently as a figure for the relationship of God and Israel, and appearing often in the Song of Songs. None of this changes the fundamental power imbalance in the relationship of the man and the woman, of course. The wife is subservient to the husband as the ewe is subservient to the shepherd. But seeing the connection to the biblical imagery of the relationship between God and Israel, the Lord is my shepherd, for example, may help mitigate some of the negativity that Akiva's wife reference to Proverbs may elicit in us today. Another interesting perspective on the use of the quotation from Proverbs, and perhaps one that is more convincing, is offered by the Talmud scholar Shama Friedman. His work is a beautiful example of the ways in which meticulous academic scholarship can enlighten the meaning of an ancient text. Friedman, examining manuscript versions of the texts that quote our Akiva story in other works, shows that the quotation that his wife uses in the Talmudic text may in fact not be the verse that was originally intended. Rather than Proverbs 12:10, these other manuscripts quote Proverbs 29:7, which has a similar structure but a completely different meaning. A righteous man is concerned with the cause of the wretched. If this is indeed the verse that should appear here, it makes a good deal of sense. Rather than Akiva's wife saying, Akiva will recognize me despite my humble clothing, because the master always knows his own animal, she is saying, I don't need to be wearing fancy clothing. Being a righteous and compassionate man, Akiva will care about my wretched and downtrodden state. This casts a very different light on their reunion, and in the context of Akiva's rebuke of his students, everything we are is thanks to her. This quotation from Proverbs is particularly apt. The story ends by bringing events full circle through the reconciliation of Akiva and his father-in-law. The fairy tale feel of the story is only intensified by this ending. But the last scene also continues the theme of knowledge and true understanding that we have been examining. Kalba Savua did not recognize Akiva's abilities when Akiva was young, and now he quite literally fails to recognize Akiva when the great scholar stands before him. It seems clear that the Talmud wants us to see Kalba Savua in a negative light by presenting these events in such a symbolically resonant fashion. Moreover, a darker side to his character may be embodied in his very name. Earlier, I quoted the explanation of Kalba Savua given in both the Babylonian Talmud and Avot de Rabbi Nathan. A person could go to his house as hungry as a dog and come out satiated. But there is another, and in fact more literal translation of his name, that is, satisfied dog. Is that who the man is supposed to be? Not the paragon of generosity who tried to save Jerusalem during the siege before its destruction, but rather a smug, self-satisfied snob who refuses to let his daughter marry the love of her life and goes so far as to banish her from his house. Judging Kalba Savua, however, is not so easy. We can sympathize with his wanting to do well by his daughter, but we wonder whether perhaps his concern is more for his own social status than for his daughter's welfare. He was, after all, quick to cut off her finances and send her away from his home. We don't know much about her own motivations. Perhaps she was a rebellious teenager, out to goad her father by pushing the limits of respectability. Perhaps she felt constrained by a domineering father and wanted to break away. Her choice of Akiva was sure to infuriate her father, and that is precisely what she might have intended. Still, it is hard to view her as a rebellious rich girl looking to stir the overly bourgeois and conventional pot at home, given the very positive light in which she is presented in the stories we have examined. We don't need to see any of that negativity in the portrait of her married life. One wonders whether the hard knocks life in a cold hayloft may have tamed whatever irresponsible impulses were within her. When she saw Elijah in the guise of a poor man, she came face to face with the real difficulties of poverty. She was no longer living in luxury, true, but others were far worse off than she was. She becomes a person willing to sacrifice for a larger cause. And what of her father? No matter how we view his relationship with his daughter in her youth, his treatment in rejecting her as despicable, but as this story ends, we are given some redemptive hints about Kalba Savua. Most telling is the fact that he is hoping to annul the vow of rejection that he made all those years ago. By the calculus of this story, it has been at least 24 years, of course. In Talmudic culture, a vow is not a casual matter. Indeed, many passages of the Talmud are devoted to the complexity of the issue of vows. What constitutes a vow, and in what way a vow can be nullified. Kalba Savua hears that a great sage has come to town and goes to discover from this sage how he might rid himself of the vow he made years ago, that she would not benefit from his wealth. Of course, he has no idea that the great sage is Akiva himself. The fact that the story emphasizes his regret, his desire to undo the past, casts a different light on Kalba Savua. He may be a satisfied dog, but in this case it appears that he is betrothed by the foolish words that came out of his mouth when his daughter announced that she wanted to marry Akiva. He thus becomes considerably more complex character in the reader's eyes, and the fact that he values Torah learning also adds to his credit. Akiva asks him, if you had known that your daughter's husband was a great man, would you have made that vow? By great man, we are to understand great in learning, not great in wealth or social status, but great in Torah. That is clear from Kalba Savua's answer. If he had known only one chapter or even only one law, I would not have made that vow. Immediately upon hearing those words, Akiva reveals himself. It seems that the acknowledgement of the importance of learning is precisely what persuades Akiva to tell Kalba Savua the truth. So even Kalba Savua, who seems at first to be the villain of the piece, is transformed. He too moves from uncertainty to understanding. He too comes to know Akiva for who he is. This understanding is confirmed by the gesture that Kalba Savua makes, falling on his face and kissing Akiva's feet, a sign of the ultimate respect in the ancient world. More importantly, this act mimics what Akiva's wife did upon greeting Akiva. She, the one who has always truly known Akiva, makes the gesture that her father imitates, indicating that he too has moved towards understanding the greatness of the man who married his daughter. On top of that, hold on a second, folks. I want to see how much is left in this chapter. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think this is all about 6 pages to go in this chapter, and I think our time's up for today. So we'll call it a day for today, and we will come back to this on Monday. We're 1/3 of the way through the book, so maybe we can knock it off in 6 sessions. I'm not sure. We'll see. I've only got 2 days in so far, so yeah, let's aim to come back to this spot on Monday. Come on, you. I'm just trying to make sure I know where I'm at from my notes. I'm not sure if you're enjoying this, but I think this chapter, definitely I got a better feel for it than the first introduction and first chapter we read. I think this is a little more truthful to the way people looked at it, for sure. I really love how he paints that imagery of the view of the idealized marriage at that era the Talmud was being finalized, and kind of gives us a glimpse into the ethics of that time and also the state. Nonetheless, whether you agree with it or not, I mean, that's the message they were trying to convey. But we will come back to more of this wonderful book, Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud, and learn more about his life and draw some more lessons from that. So I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom weekend, and we will be back Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern on Monday. Till then, have a wonderful, wonderful week, everybody. Bye for now.